Thank you so much to everyone, and thanks for having us here. We've had the last 8 months being quite a turbulent discussion within the task force, and some of the members of the task force who are with me today can probably testify to it. It's also been a really interesting time for DPI under India's presidency of the G20, because as some of you may have been tracking, the DPI, or digital public infrastructure, has found its way into multiple diplomatic declarations, whether it's with the EU, India's declaration with the EU, with the United States, with France. Everywhere there's this great amount of enthusiasm to build and deploy DPI together. So what we are going to try to understand in today's conversation, and also what we've attempted to do with the task force report, is to see what are affordable, accessible, and inclusive digital public infrastructure, which was the overarching theme for our task force. But then also what we talked about was ideas of digital financial inclusion and social protection, and how DPI can instrumentalize that. Interoperability of digital services and standard setting, which is really critical as we think about the idea of collaboration around DPI. And then, of course, digital entrepreneurship, skills, and jobs, because none of this can happen unless we have the capacity and the skills to build some of this out. So I have this fantastic panel, and I'm going to start with Parminder on just sort of take us through this journey over the last 8 months of obviously being in part of the task force, but also what you think has happened as India has journeyed through its DPI narrative and its G20 presidency.
Thank you, Asta. I think the journey in the task force actually reflects the journey of understanding the digital society. And there are typically two kinds of people in these conversations. One kind who believe that nothing has changed and more or less everything is the same. And there's other, which I call digital exceptionalism kinds, most digital activists who think everything has fundamentally changed. And I do believe that we need to look at continuity, which is very important, and also know things have fundamentally changed. And even in our task force, I remember there were people coming from both backgrounds. And there were pushes, therefore, well, it's just the way it was, and others say, no, things have changed. And I think what, during these months, have occurred is that people normally agree that digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, is a thing. Nobody is against industrial infrastructure. Right? There's no discussion, are you for industrial infrastructure or against industrial infrastructure, right? So more or less, there is some sense of calm or agreement that, like in industrial society, there were certain infrastructures. In the digital society, also there is something called infrastructure, and then the discussion starts, what would be infrastructure, and if it is that infrastructure, what kind of governmental interventions are needed, how deep, how would you govern? And just last point, this was the continuity point. Like, there were roads, there were bridges, banks as infrastructure. Now we have payment systems, data exchange systems, interconnectivity systems as infrastructures. But there's also a difference, and quickly I'll point out to 2-3 issues, which actually a whole paper can be written on it. Now, unlike industrial infrastructure, digital infrastructure can come and disappear very quickly. Now, you make a road, the road is there forever, right? You trust there is reliability, there is certitude that there's a road. But DPIs can be there or not there. And then the social nexus of the DPI with the social economic activity it influences or changes is very deep, and that raises different kind of governance questions which may not have existed in the industrial infrastructure, and I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Parminder, and that's a nice sort of segue into YJ, because I think what Parminder is saying is that we need to figure out whether if it looks like a DPI, walks like a DPI, is it a DPI question. And I know that Korea has been doing a lot of fantastic work on the digital government platform, which again looks like a DPI. Yeah. And would love to understand how, obviously in your journey as a task force member, but also as you've been observing the India narrative, how do you think we can build those pathways for collaboration where two countries are doing similar but things differently in some ways?
Yes. When I was involved with this like a task force, many of us we've been focusing on the digital public infrastructure too closely. So I think I missed the timing to bring the Korea's experiment on the digital platform government, which actually has a very similar philosophy like digital public infrastructure. So this concept has been there for a while, but this concept has been more specific under the current administration. The President Yoon Suk-yeol kind of announced this will be our very strategic move for the future of Korea. And so when he said that, when he kind of like introduced the roadmap for digital platform government for Korea, what he said was a very striking comment that we may not really know the role of government when this platform government is completely mature. So probably everything would be run by AI-based, cloud-based kind of the processing. So a lot of policy making would be based on those data-driven environment. Then what would be the role of government? So even though we may not know whether there will still role for the substantial role for the government, he emphasizes it's very critical and for us to push it forward. So like the DPI, because as far as I understand DPI, you have a very open platform, the open API. You invite the private sector together with the startup, everybody, and encourage them to use open government data and to explore the different business models which can benefit not only the digital public services like the government, but also the citizens themselves. And so that's the exact concept. But one concept which has been more emphasized is the role of citizens in this whole design. So the government is proactively reaching out to the citizens and those civil society groups or academics. If you have any ideas, if you have any opinions about which service should be included, this digital platform government, you are welcome to do so. So we have this kind of consultation process with the citizens, and the target timeline for the government to bring the new platform is by 27. So 27, they really wanted to bring a lot of services in this digital platform, but we start to introduce some outcome of the product from sometime next year. So some of those services can be available even from next year. So in that sense, the DPI of this India's initiative, and then the DPZ, the Digital Platform Governments of Korea's initiative, can be very aligned.
That's really helpful. And especially as we think about collaboration between countries, but also across different sectors. And I'll come to you, Chintan, because I know you've been working on Startup 20, and what we think of as DPI is critical as public infrastructure with private innovation, and that's also what's worked in the Indian context. And I guess as we've been talking is that there's maybe a level of trust that we need to think about when it comes to DPI, because they're still fairly new and countries are experimenting with it. And for startups to be able to lean into the idea of the DPI, we need to think about how we communicate that trustworthiness so startups can come and innovate with DPI. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on because a lot of the conversation is about DPI will help address the monopolies of big tech, but we have to get startups involved. What does the DPI ecosystem need to do for that?
One of the dimensions of the DPIs that we didn't really expect to discuss as much in Startup 20, but we ended up discussing a lot, was, well, first of all, the idea of Startup 20 was like any G20 groups is what can you do as 20 that you can't do as one, right? So in Startup 20, that idea was, how do you make startups integral to the global economic discourse? And incidentally, the startups that are most ready to be amenable to a global economic discourse are the digital startups. Because the physical startups, or the material-oriented startups, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Different countries are at different places. But digitals are able to go across much more easily. So they became very important to this conversation. Now, one of the very striking things about the digital public infrastructure, what it has done, which we have been very silent about, not by intention, but just because we haven't really paid attention to it, is that one of the key metrics for, startups live for markets, not for anything else, right? One of the key metrics for being successful in the market is to have as low as possible the cost of customer acquisition. And digital public infrastructure in India, for example, all things considered, has really dramatically reduced the cost of customer acquisition, which is very striking for a digital startup coming from the outside into India. When it begins to make the business sense, then the trust becomes in some ways secondary. And that, I mean, unless there's a great deal of distrust, which there isn't. So in that sense, I think it is something that we really have to first acknowledge. Second, it will allow nations that have strong digital public infrastructure to attract digital startups because their business case is stronger. And this is one reason, a very pragmatic reason, to take such an infrastructure forward from the perspective of the startup land. Let me stop there.
No, thanks so much for that. And Chada, to you, I know that you've been doing a lot of work with marginalized groups, particularly thinking about women and getting them into the digital sphere. And also what we're trying to talk about when we talk about DPI is that it does, to also the point that Chintan made, is maybe democratize some access and make certain systems available to citizens, makes them, as Vijay said, build for efficiency, build for inclusion. And just from your perspective, where do you think in the broader LMIC or low and middle income countries context, do DPIs fit into that idea of citizen inclusion?
Sure, absolutely. I think this is important. I'll link it basically with your previous question actually regarding startups and how can they actually really get into the global, I would say, collaboration in that aspect. By definition, again, also, if we're talking about digital startups, we're talking about digital scale and growth, right? One of the main, I would say, criteria for having actually a startup in the digital sphere is actually you have this accelerated growth in terms of users and in terms basically of people who are using your digital products. And in order to do that, what you need is basically some kind of user empathy. The user empathy is even actually one of the many hypotheses that we have in the user experiences and designing the user experience of the digital product the way it is. And nowadays, what we're seeing more thoughtfulness around is around basically having this user across all different genders, across all different also inclusiveness in terms of financial inclusiveness also. We want to make sure that the cost of, as you mentioned, the cost of the internet, the cost of basically making sure for the phones also, are we having basically the real needed penetration in that aspect for phone users, and are we only building for phone users or laptop users and so on and so forth. Today in this world in 2023, we're still only having 64% penetration of the internet across the world. And this is something that we need to have more governments, more infrastructure, digital infrastructure towards it, more companies to work on making sure that we have the needs set as in digital infrastructure to enable these basically innovators as startups to come in and build for inclusiveness. Building for inclusiveness in itself is something that needs to have this infrastructure in place to make sure that we are working together and making basically this empathy from a digital perspective in place as well.
No, that makes sense because it seems like we're in a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, which is that we have to build the DPI to get adoption, and then to get adoption, we need to have the DPI. But I wanted to shift gears a little bit and really focus on what G20 can do, because what we've heard so far is that there are different definitions, there are different perspectives, countries are doing their own sets of tasks around digital public infrastructure, however you might define it. There is some value add for citizens and startups, but also how do we get them to adopt this more? So to you, Parminder, as we sort of wind down the T20 engagement, two questions on that, and is what can G20 do as the presidency moves to Brazil? Because we also know that Brazil has the PIX, which is a version of a DPI as well. And then also, how do we stay with this DPI conversation in the agenda?
There are two questions or the one? Yeah.
What can G20 do and how do we stay on the agenda with DPI?
How we keep it in the agenda?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I think a big part has been done by India. I mean, India is very early ages. At times, nobody a few months back or 2 years back knew what is DPI, and India showed what is DPI, right? Aadhaar is DPI, UPI is DPI. That's a good thing. People make sense of things when they see things. But after they have seen it, you have to theorize it. And there are two ways to tell what a car is. One is to show cars on the street and say, these are the cars. And other is to give a definition of something, and people can go around and see if that fits that description, that's a car. So we reached that stage, I think, when India has familiarized people, including through this G20 process. Many of them would have probably first time heard the name digital public infrastructure, and I'm assured a big number has. But now they've learned by seeing this is a DPI. We are at that stage, and two things need to be done. And I think India needs to perform a little better on that. Having given great examples, which is pioneering and is the best work anybody could have done. Now we need to theorize it, give definitions of what would be DPI. As you were seeing, somebody can then recognize if it talks like DPI and walks like DPI, then they can start calling it a DPI. And if you really go around, and you probably in Venezuela or in Mozambique or Philippines, you actually find things, and you can actually tell them, this thing looks like a DPI. So one, theorize it, and then include global examples, because you have this big bucket of global examples, well theorized, and then people start looking at it as, well, like as I was saying, in industrial age, infrastructure was necessary. We do need infrastructure, people are doing it. If it is well theorized, then there is a certain certitude and reliability about it. Now, why certitude and reliability is needed is both sides. The business needs it and society needs it. Actually, people say businesses are against rules. They're not so much against rules as they are against non-reliability. What would happen tomorrow vis-a-vis what is today? And if they get certitude and reliability in rules, then they're fine. And we know this code is law and architecture is policy. And DPIs become a law, It configures what you can do or cannot do, and then it becomes a coercive force doing it. They need to know that what is being offered today would still be the same in 5 years, and they can make their business practices like that. Or it will evolve in a relatively recognizable form. So business needs it, but society also needs it, because when we make a techno-structure, we lock inequities, we lock possibilities, we lock things. Some engineer sitting in a room who did it without having understood what are the socio-economic dimensions of it. So I think we have to socialize it a lot.
And that's a G20 function for you.
Yes, that's G20 function. And I'm going to come to the end that to do that, it has to evolve principles. I'm writing a paper on which we have identified 10 principles. First, recognize what would be a DPI. Second, recognize what level of interventions are needed in DPI. Then be sure that you decentralize from the start. Like that, you develop a principle and actually go forward beyond it. And I think there should be a framework law in soon on DPIs. About what generally DPIs would be. So there is a certitude both for business and the society. And within that framework law, then sectoral DPIs can make their sectoral laws. And I think law is needed now, because law provides certainty both to the business and to the social economic considerations which we are talking about. I think that probably answers. To Brazil, I think we take from the more practical towards a better theorization and more globally inclusive model. And by the time we reach South Africa, the IPSA, Troika, we probably have a very good thing called DPIs as an essential need of our digital societies, both for the sake of equity, but also to check the big tech thing. Thank you.
No, perfect. Thanks so much. And sorry, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment maybe on this in terms of the law and the businesses. I can speak of the businesses since basically we deal with the law with entrepreneurs and we kind of actually raise them. Entrepreneurs really, and it's true, sometimes what you wanted to say basically in terms of businesses are against the law is not much that, but the innovation, they say the innovation is sometimes in places where there is no real regulation yet or there is no law yet. That's true, the innovation can start there. But what also the entrepreneurs are looking for, the uncertainty that would help them have the analytics certainty as well for their own businesses. At the end of the day, they are there actually for profit, and profit needs data. And for you to have relevant data, you need to be able to do those predictions that you want to do for future. And that only comes with certain rules and certain regulations in place that you know these will have the guidelines for your analytics that actually, oh yes, now I am certain that this prediction is actually in place. I have a profit plan and I have so on and so forth. So this is my scale growth or this is my growth plan and so on and so forth. So for businesses, it's true that innovation starts where there is no regulation yet, but for this innovation to continue and to be basically really on a continuous manner, then this only happens where actually regulation is there and law is there.
No, that makes sense. And I think what we're also trying to grapple with is how do we govern DPI, which are anchored around principles of openness and interoperability, because we also want to create that space of innovation, of collaboration, but then also make sure that we follow the principles of do no harm and allow for inclusivity. But to you, YJ, I think what Parminder is talking about is like a consensus-driven framework for what DPIs are. But like we were just talking about, Korea and several other countries have their own versions of what DPI is. Does that, like this broader consensus, does that allow for space for country-level innovation and collaboration, or would that get subsumed if there was a G20 level consensus?
Well, as I kind of understand, and probably a lot of you understand this DPI and the concept of DPZ, which I introduced, this is e-government. That means it's more like the national setting. You design all those services according to your demands, according to your kind of like the citizens' request. So the versions of this DPI can be varying. And so it will be a little bit inappropriate to build too much consensus. I think every country requires to build the DPI. That's for sure. And however, the details of DPI might be different. And so for countries, maybe they can, share their knowledge, how they can design their version of DPIs among the G20 member states, and they can be very valuable. And as you said, and some of the countries, they can kind of exchange bilateral collaboration or whatever kind of the strategic working relationship. I think both India, also Korea, kind of targeting the same goals. You really wanted to build very well designed these DPI mechanisms or digital platform government, and you wanted to promote that concept to not only the G20 members, but also many other states who are interested in adopting that kind of the models. And so it can be kind of a lot of innovation and competitions are associated with the process. And so probably that's the role for the G20. Maybe all those member states who are interested in pursuing this direction can do that. But the reason why we had some difficulties of, for example, like at DEWG, Digital Economy Working Group, was because of this terminology of the public. Because some countries, somehow they had issues with this public part because a lot of their infrastructure has been already set up by the private sectors. So they had those issues. So probably that's the kind of the negotiation we can go through down the road.
Oh, that's helpful. And Chintan, as you represent the private part of this conversation as well, to understand, like, is there that tussle between the public and the private, and also what does that mean for, the Startup 20 and the G20 process, and as we think about the adoption of DPI, because we've done a lot of the thinking, and I agree with Parminder that there's some more theorizing required, but we definitely need to start moving towards the question of how do we build for adoption, and how do we drive adoption?
Yeah. I think this is a very rich conversation, by the way. The questions you're asking making me think of several things. I think there's one aspect. I mean, you already used the word principles, which already abstracts this, abstracts us a little higher than exact designs. But it occurs to me that there's an analogous problem that we had to deal with in Startup 20. For example, startups, the way that animal is defined in different jurisdictions is different slightly because that definition really is from the perspective of their industrial legacy as to what is it that you're trying to protect initially when there's less regulation, there's the penetration of these new types of entities. We realize that getting to a single definition is not possible, but getting to a framework that defines this startup is possible. So we sort of we went a step higher. We said that if you, based on the type of legal entity, the age, the size, the scalability, and the innovation, if you take that, and then each dimension has multiple options. If you take that perspective, then all definitions can be accommodated, first of all. You can begin to delineate what is a traditional MSME versus a startup. In other words, when you begin to think about sort of scalability and innovation, that is not a mom and pop shop anymore, for example. Similarly, I think the DPI question is going to be that what are the principles of designing this? Individual DPI, that will classify something as a DPI. But then how do you make them interoperate? Because this is the India versus South Korea, et cetera, right? This is not a new question. I mean, I think we have built systems that have this layered architecture for interoperation, et cetera. So, absolutely agree with that the legacy matters, because I think the more industrialized nations, their challenge is not in principle agreement to the utility of a DPI, but their challenge is to really implement it given their private sector legacy. I will stay away from using the word regulatory capture, but anyway. So there's some lessons here, because I think those are maybe because the unit of analysis in the startup land is just a startup at a time, and it's smaller and easier and faster moving, so you can track it better. Whereas here with DPIs, the scale is so humongous that you can't afford to make a mistake.
Agreed. No. And Chada, just to you, I mean, again, like, what can G20 do? Because I understand that, you've been also observing the process from the outside. And so what can the G20 process do to keep the conversation on DPI alive?
I think the conversation is alive, and we need to, as you mentioned, keep it up. And for any conversation, usually actually to stay in there is basically to really enhance where are the areas of improvement and really highlight those actually again and again once for basically discussion and in terms of really looking into what are the possible solutions for it, but also to dig deeper into those actually issues and get into it. One of the issues you mentioned is adoption, and I want to dig deeper a little bit actually on this one. For me, adoption and to kind of like really get this this DPI into more governments and to basically more into the world and solve more problems of the society, really the governments and the leaders have to solve for three main issues. First of all is basically, as we mentioned earlier, is the intuitiveness, making sure that this user experience is intuitive as much as possible, and that people of all backgrounds, of all layers, are able to actually access it. Again, you're not having a very niche market here. You're not solving for a specific persona as you usually do it in your own businesses, but you're really solving for all society, because DPI or the government services, as she mentioned earlier, everyone needs to use them at the end of the day. And if they don't feel that this is easier than going actually to the office and getting that paper, they're not going to do it. They're going to feel that this is actually more headache for me, so why go through that? So it's very important to have that kind of empathy with the user experience, that someone who is actually 15 years old, who is a digital native, who is Gen Z, can use it, but also someone who is 60 years old can actually also use it in a very, very easy manner and in an intuitive way. So that's the first one. The second one is actually reliability. Reliability builds trust. And that trust between the users and between the government or the builders is very important. And this is something that actually ensures the long-term running. This is not a project that actually we want to have it for like just 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. This is a long-term project that's actually revolving the nation, and it's really pushing not just only the digital aspect of the digital economy, but the whole thriveness of the world actually in that aspect, which will also enable the South-South collaboration, other collaboration, as we mentioned. So it's important to have this reliability, both technically and non-technically, in terms of what the user is looking for. Is there the context that the user is looking for, the timeless basically of when exactly to launch this and how to launch it. All of that is very important, because that's what builds the trust capital, I call it, that actually the user comes back to you and use it again. The third point, and which maybe actually is related to the first as well, is to make sure that this DPI and this portal in itself is actually something that is widely interoperable. What this means that multiple and different aspects can actually integrate to it and can make sure. This is what happens, what she mentions earlier is about the Korean and the Indian collaboration. This what enables someone actually can use the Indian DPI for something else. When you don't build from scratch, when you build from something that actually is already there, and when you have this integration open and those API, that's when innovation comes in. That's really where entrepreneurs, startups, public sector, private sector, all of them together are able to easily find the ways of innovation in there. Because when you built it, you already built it on something that's actually by nature and by default is integratable, I would say. So those are the main points in that.
And just on interoperability, I mean, India's DPIs are built for interoperability and extensibility, and so that's something that's definitely been embedded. I'm determined to take questions from the audience because I know the last few panels have run short on time. So this is the time for any questions from the audiences, if there are.
Can you request the central government, can they hold an annual meet for the startups, for the emerging startups inside the nation itself, just like an exhibition, and so that those youths can represent in the startup 20s, so the selected youths, they can perform in the global platforms. So can you request the central government to host, like every month they can host in some state and they can pick up, and then annually in center, then they can send to the startup 20 or Y20, something like that.
If you can put a DPI spin to that question, I'd appreciate it.
There's a layered architecture here also. In the sense, answer is yes, I think this is already going to happen from next year. I mean, this year it happened under various, say, Startup 20 had a large international startup conclave. But the proposal now, which will be carried out by the office that I represent, the Atal Innovation Mission, is to do an annual startup conclave, which will be international. The idea is to design it such that it is at three levels. So local startup type of events, followed by state level startup events, followed by that that international one. So that's how it's going to be designed. So already in works, but thank you.
Yeah.
No, sir, thank you.
Great. Any other DPI related questions, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for the rich discussion. My name is Wolf Reiners. I work for the German Institute of Development and Sustainability. We also hosted an associated event 2 days ago on digital commons.
Oh, perfect.
And so DPI was at the heart of our discussion there as well. And I would like to direct a question to actually all task force members to elaborate a little bit on your discussions relating data flows. So free flow of data, maybe also data localization in respect to also previous discussion with geopolitical aspirations and so on. But given that DPI, the DPI example and India's offering, key offering, as it says for the G20, what comes with this dimension, right? So where does the data sit? How is it governed? And what role can the G20 play in this context? I would be very interested in that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Great question, Parminder.
I can answer it in very short, that almost all digital trade discussions globally, including at G20, stop because of that question and do not proceed year after year after year. And since you want to put that question to this DPI panel, I think it's a tricky affair. I'd rather avoid going into it. But as Asa knows, I love to talk about it, by the way. But I'll pass it on.
YJ, would you dare to come in on that tricky question?
Yes, I think so. By design, this DPI or DPZ, the data will be localized. So I think but if those the countries who agree to have interoperable kind of the connections, they should have some kind of the understanding or agreement how they will allow those data can flow. But taking advantage of this, I wanted to kind of
Uh,
highlight the ambassador of the India, who are based in Korea, met with the chairman of the digital platform government several weeks ago. And so indeed those two countries started to explore how we can work together. And so the Indian ambassador in Korea invited the chairman of the digital platform government. And so there will be a lot of some kind of dialogue between two countries who are seeking very similar, the digital public services. And then the one more thing, I think probably Paminda can understand where I'm coming from, because we've been working on the internet governance for many years. In that domain, we had a lot of struggle of what could be the role of government and what could be the role of private sector, what could be the role of the citizens and civil societies, especially when we understand how internet or digital society should be governed. And now I think those governments started to wake up. So when we discussed this internet governance, and of course it is a very private sector oriented multi-stakeholder principle. And this is all about multi-stakeholderism. And the previous session was about multilateralism, where they didn't even consider other stakeholders that much. But in the context of a multi-stakeholder, we really have to find a balance. But so when we talk about this internet governance, it was very private sector oriented multi-stakeholderism. So now, as the Chima was warning us, this disruptive technology called as AI is coming to us. And so when AI is coming to our society, I hope our government should be more aware about this kind of the threats. And now governments in many places, like including G20, they now understand this role of the digital public services and then digital platform government, where they recognize the role of a private sector, the role of the citizens, who should be also the decision-making stakeholders. So in that sense, I think we are in a very right momentum for us to head toward a very balanced new technology society.
Right. Those sounded like closing comments. So I'm going to give all the other three panelists 30 seconds because I'll take the last 30 myself. Start, Parminder, with you.
I can start. I think in 30 seconds is difficult, but I think we have to also address the elephant in the room of DPIs, which is the state interface with the society. And I actually really say, and this is very controversial, that as society gets digitized, the state has less and less points of intervention. And I actually look at it in a positive sense that DPIs do give points of intervention into the society. But that should not be some erratic, just I decided today to do it, and therefore it should be legally supported.
Right.
It should be based by law. But however, the other side of it, of course, is an authoritarian state. So we need to figure out that balance, that we use DPIs for actual regulation in a proper manner, but just don't go overboard with it. And that part of the DPI is important.
Chada?
For me, my last statement would be that it's very important and vital for the governments basically to build those DPIs with the user in mind. And when we say the user in mind, is the society with all the genders, the society with all the backgrounds, with all financial basically inclusiveness as well, making sure that this DPI is accessible in multiple platforms, making this DPI intuitive and is very easy to use so that actually the government services are now really the way actually to go and the really way to ease the problems and a way to close this gap that actually we're showing also in gender equality.
For me, it would be that digital public goods infrastructure will be a reality in the future for all nations. Which form they come into is their legacy will decide that. But I think one part of this story that is not getting explored as much is there's no research on the institutional side of it. Digital architectures are easier to build, but reforming governance, which is the complement to it for the adoption of it, is much harder to do. And the adoption internationally will not scale up that fast unless institutional side of it also gets researched and democratized.
Right. So all of this to say that the DPI conversation is very much alive and kicking. Brazil has a tough job ahead of its presidency as it tries to unbundle some of these issues and really drive for adoption. I think what we're hearing is that the role of the G20 is very much to enable, obviously, to instantiate some of this thinking, to mainstream it, but also to see what kind of frameworks we can build to govern and to build for inclusion. And then also, of course, how do we do that while allowing for, other approaches and sort of an eclecticism in terms of what DPI is. So thank you so much, and thank you to my panelists.